Screencast number 6 and the last one of the unit, and I'm excited because I promised myself that when I got done with this I could go for a long bike ride, which is what I'm going to do. So let's get on with it, shall we? Conflicting Schools of Thought, Part 2. Last time we learned about the Keynesians, the monetarists, and the rational expectations theorists. This time we're going to look at a couple of other minority views, none of which are as important, but which you need to know about. Alright, let's start with the supply-siders. Now I'm going to keep it short and simple here because we've talked about the supply-siders before. Main idea with the supply-siders, focus on aggregate supply, do not focus on aggregate demand. Moving aggregate demand to the right means a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Moving aggregate supply to the right means no trade-off. We get the best of both worlds. So how do you do that again? Well, two things. You reduce taxes on businesses, make it easier and cheaper for them to produce, and you reduce government regulations. Now, all of that I've mentioned before. The thing I want to add about the supply-siders here is that there's one more benefit to the supply-side perspective. And supply-siders tend to be conservatives, free market type people. This is a benefit that liberals, progressives, people who think that the government should have a role in the economy and like government involvement in the economy, a benefit that they'll see to the supply-side argument as well. And the benefit is essentially that by reducing taxes on businesses, not only can we increase aggregate supply, we could also get the government more money, which is kind of counterintuitive, because if you're reducing taxes, how is it that the government's actually collecting more money? Well, the story goes that there was an economist whose name was Laffer, and that's unfortunately his actual name, who back in the late 70s, early 1980s was in a bar and trying to explain to someone his idea that if you lower tax rates on businesses and other people, that the government might actually collect more money. And to illustrate it, he kind of drew this graph out on a napkin, and this graph became famous. It became called the Laffer curve. So I'm going to show you what that looks like and show you what Laffer's argument was. All right, so to start us off, take a look at the axes on this graph. On the y-axis, we have tax rate. You know, what percentage of people's money should we take from them? 0%, 10%, 80%, 100%. On the x-axis, we have tax revenue. How many dollars will the government collect at these various tax rates? So let me bring you down to the very bottom of the graph. What the curve says is that when the tax rate is 0%, the government's going to collect $0, which of course makes sense. As we raise taxes, the amount of tax revenues that the government's going to collect will go up as well. But here's the idea. The idea is that if we raise taxes too much, the government might actually start collecting less money. So initially, as we raise tax rates, the amount of revenues that the government collects will increase. But at some point, continuing to raise tax rates isn't going to increase government revenues, it's actually going to decrease them. And as we increase tax rates further, we might actually decrease them all the way to 0. Now, to understand why, think about what it would mean to have a tax rate of 100%. A tax rate of 100% would mean that the government's going to take all of your money. And if we had a tax rate of 100%, nobody would work, right? Why go out to work if the government's simply going to take all of your money? So we'll have the government collecting $0 if the tax rate is 0%. We'll also have the government collecting $0 if the tax rate is 100%. So somewhere in between, there's some optimal level of tax rate that's going to collect the most money. In this graph, it's a tax rate of M, some percentage, that would actually generate the most revenue for the government. Now, the dispute between liberals and conservatives is what that tax rate actually is. Now, this graph is a little bit deceptive because it's making it appear as if the tax rate is at 50%, which it's not. There's a big dispute about what that optimal tax rate is. So, for example, in the 1990s, President Clinton raised the top tax rate from roughly 35% to 39%. And as a result of that, tax revenues increased. Now, some people make the argument that today we're above M. That the economy's changed, that it's actually the case that if we were to lower taxes, and notice that at any tax rate above M, lowering taxes will increase revenue to the government. So what Laffer was saying is that beyond the positive effects that aggregate supply shifts to the right would have, besides the positive effects that cuts in tax rates would have on our ADAS model, it would also have this added benefit of actually increasing the amount of money the government collected, which if you're a liberal, you should like, because that means the government can do more things. All right, just one thing I wanted to add about supply-siders that we didn't get to before. A couple of other minor points. None of these are as important as what we saw in the last screencast, but I want you to be aware of them. There's another school of thought called real business cycle theory, and the definition is basically the explanation, so let me give that to you. What the real business cycle theorists say is that instability or business cycles in the economy are caused by real factors that affect aggregate supply. Things like significant changes in technology or resource availability, they're not about aggregate demand factors. So in some sense, this is kind of like an offshoot of the supply-siders. What they're essentially saying is all this monetary and fiscal policy stuff is just nonsense. What happens in the economy, what causes the economy to change, are real things. Are we at war or not? Is the internet invented or not? Can we go to the Mars and mine those resources or not? That everything else is just kind of footnotes to what the real economy is doing. All right, and then finally for this unit, there are some people, economists who think, all of this stuff is just kind of nonsense, that the economy gets better or worse due to what are called coordination failures, which you can think of as essentially self-fulfilling prophecies. What's a coordination failure? Well, let's say you're walking down the hallway and you're about to walk into someone, and so you both have to move out of the way. If you both move out of the way in the same direction, you're still going to be in each other's way. That's a coordination failure. Or another example. Let's say you got invited to a party this weekend and you're thinking about whether to go to the party, but you don't want to go if nobody else is going to go. And since you're not sure if everyone else is going to go, you don't go to the party. Well, if everybody thinks the same way, nobody's going to wind up going to the party, whereas if they had all just gone, they would have probably had a good time. Well, some people think the economy's kind of like that. So let's say we're at full employment, and let's say that consumers start getting worried about the future of the economy. Maybe they fear like there'll be a recession down the road, maybe they're going to lose their jobs, and so they start worrying about their spending. They start spending a little bit less money, which in our model pushes aggregate demand to the left, and as a result of that, they actually cause the recession themselves. Businesses counter by that by laying off people since people aren't buying as much stuff. And so what these people think is that the economy is essentially one big game theory game, where if we could all just coordinate correctly, we'd never have any economic problems. All right, well, in this unit, I gave you a rough sketch of the long run story, most importantly, and then the implications of that on various schools of thought and how various economic schools of thought use or don't use that long run story to justify their views of the economy. Now, there's obviously much more to it, and you can take entire courses in college, singularly on one or more of these theories. So recognize that you just have a rough outline and maybe the beginnings of the ability to at least see the different viewpoints. All right, we are done with the unit. Good job, good job, good job.
That's not fair that I failed the test. You said that I got question 1 wrong.
You did. The Bolshevik Revolution did not result in democracy in Russia.
But a friend told me that D would be the answer.
I am aware that you were trying to cheat. That is why I changed the answers before you took the test.
That's not fair.